The moment the judge leaned forward, the entire courtroom froze. His gavel hovered in the air, the echo of silence so sharp it felt like a storm waiting to break. Every eye turned toward Traoré, the man standing alone, steady but unreadable. Then, the judge's voice cut through the stillness, sharp, cold, final. His words made one thing clear: Traoré was about to lose his freedom. A gasp spread across the room, hearts racing as if the verdict had already been carved in stone. But then, just seconds later, something no one saw coming shattered the silence, and what unfolded inside that courtroom would leave even the judge speechless as the walls shook with applause that refused to stop. The truth is, nobody expected the trial of Adama Traoré to draw such enormous attention. Outside, the courthouse steps were overflowing with people, supporters, critics, and curious strangers who had heard only fragments of the story. The air buzzed with arguments. Was he really guilty? Had he crossed a line? Or was he being punished simply because he refused to stay silent? Reporters had gathered early, cameras flashing, as though capturing the end of a historic match. Yet, this was not a game. Inside those walls, a young man's future trembled in the hands of one judge. When the heavy wooden doors creaked open that morning, dozens surged inside to claim their seats. Murmurs filled the gallery, rumors whispered, predictions made. Some believed Traoré was reckless, a troublemaker who invited chaos. Others quietly admitted he had the courage to speak the truth. Others were too afraid to utter. This mix of fear, anger, and hope turned the courtroom into a pressure cooker. Each tick of the clock sounded louder than the last, as though time itself was daring everyone to hold on until the fateful moment. Traoré himself looked strangely calm, dressed. Simply, he kept his hands clasped in front of him, his head lifted. Those who watched closely noticed something unusual in his eyes. He didn't look like a man surrendering. He looked like a man waiting for something. Yet nobody could guess what that something might be. Even before the judge spoke, tension wrapped around the room. Mothers clutched their children closer. Journalists raised their pens higher. Every small sound, the scrape of a chair, the faint cough from a corner, echoed against the stone walls. The air was so heavy it pressed into chests, refusing to be ignored. And then came the chilling shift. The judge's opening words carried not just authority, but finality. His tone suggested that decisions had already been made behind closed doors. As he looked down at Traoré, his eyes sharp and unblinking, there was an edge in his voice that whispered, "This man is finished." People leaned forward, some nodding grimly, others shaking their heads in silent protest. They thought they knew what would come next. They thought they understood the script. But what they didn't know, the story was about to flip on its head. The judge's gavel struck wood with a hollow echo that rattled hearts. "Order in the court," he commanded, although the silence was already suffocating. He turned toward Traoré, his robe draped like a shadow. "You think your words make you brave," he said sharply, "but they make you dangerous, and danger does not walk free." A murmur slid through the crowd, half outrage, half satisfaction. Mothers shook their heads. Some men clenched fists tightly at their sides. Yet Traoré didn't move. No breakdown, no collapse. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if considering the judge's words like a chess player examining his opponents. Move. That quietness, that poise, unsettled the room more than shouting ever could. Then came the first twist. As the judge motioned toward the bailiff to prepare custody papers, a voice rang out from the middle rows. "Objection!" Not from a lawyer, from an old man rising slowly on trembling legs. Gasps filled the chamber. No audience member was allowed to interrupt. Security moved instantly, yet the old man raised a wrinkled hand, clutching a folder. "I cannot stay silent any longer," he declared. "There is evidence you have not reviewed. Evidence that changes everything. The gallery exploded in whispers. The judge's face stiffened, struggling between fury and curiosity. "Remove him immediately," he barked. But the old man's next words froze everyone mid-motion. "This trial hides more than it reveals. What you hold in your hands is half the truth, and half a truth is a whole lie." Suddenly, silence smothered the room again. The bailiff hesitated, unsure. The judge's fingers twitched around his gavel, caught between duty and doubt. And Traoré, for the first time that day, allowed the corners of his mouth to lift, just barely. It wasn't a triumph. It was recognition, as though he'd been waiting for this moment all along. The folder dropped with a heavy slap onto the prosecution's desk. Dozens craned their necks to see. Papers spilled. Records, dates, signatures. The defense attorney snatched them eagerly, flipping page after page, his eyes widening with every line. "Your Honor," he stammered, voice trembling. This changes the timeline completely," the judge frowned, his authority suddenly slipping. "Explain yourself." The lawyer straightened, gripping the pages with both hands. "The so-called evidence against my client is incomplete. What has been ignored, deliberately or conveniently, are documents showing that on the very dates of alleged crimes, Traoré was under restricted observation. These records prove he could not possibly have acted as accused." The gallery gasped again, so loud it rippled like thunder. Journalists scribbled feverishly, cameras clicked. Some spectators who had condemned Traoré sat stunned, their certainty cracking. For them, the script was supposed to end today with shame, but now Act Two had begun, unexpected, disorienting. For the first time, the judge faltered. He leaned back slowly into his chair, eyes darting between documents and the defendant. The power had shifted, his once steady voice caught on the edge of hesitation. He lifted the gavel, as if to reassert control. But this time, his hand shook, and, in that very shake, the crowd sensed it. This trial was no longer predictable. It was a story running off the rails, heading towards something no one in that room could stop. The courtroom felt like a living creature, breathing, shivering, restless. Every small flicker of movement, every inhale or cough, now sounded deafening in the heavy silence. The old man had been escorted out reluctantly, but the folder he left behind sat like dynamite on the table, ready to blow apart the case. The defense lawyer's hands trembled as he laid the documents flat, reading them aloud to the judge. Each line chipped away at the original charges. Surveillance reports, official timestamps, contradictory signatures. With every word, people leaned farther forward on their benches. Gasps burst at odd intervals, like fireworks in the night. But then another twist surfaced. The prosecutor, sweating beneath his sharp suit, suddenly slammed his palm against the desk. "This is irrelevant," he roared, though his eyes betrayed fear. "These records are planted. This entire disruption is nothing but a trick." "Enough." The judge cut him off harshly, though his own voice wavered. "Do you have grounds to prove that claim?" The prosecutor faltered. His mouth opened, then closed. Scribbles of notes lay scattered, but none could defend him. And at that precise moment, a new sound pierced the tension, the clang of another door at the far corner of the courtroom. Everyone turned. Another figure had entered, a middle-aged woman in a plain suit carrying a small black box. She was not on any witness list. Security looked uncertain, but she strode forward with remarkable confidence, stopping only when she stood beside the defense table. Without a word, she placed the box down, clicked it open, and revealed a tape recorder. The moment she pressed play, static crackled, and then a voice emerged. Familiar, unmistakable. It was the prosecutor's voice. "If we push this case hard enough, nobody will dare question us again. Traoré will be made an example." The room exploded. Some shouted, others cursed. The gallery shifted like a riot about to burst through its leash. The judge's face was drained of color. The prosecutor leapt forward, hands clawing at the tape, screaming, "This is illegal! You can't use that here!" But the damage was already done. The words repeated again and again, captured with perfect clarity. Traoré will be made an example. Journalists scrambled as pens flew, phones vibrated, messages flooded out of the courtroom like wildfire. The entire case had shifted, no longer about guilt, but about corruption. Traoré still hadn't said a word. His calm stood in violent contrast to the chaos around him. But those who watched closely noticed his eyes softened. He wasn't smiling, not yet. But the storm breaking around him was no longer his to control. It was theirs. The judge tried desperately to bang his gavel, to command silence, but the crowd ignored him. Chants began to rise. First one voice, then three, then dozens. "Let him go! Let him go!" The chant roared louder, a wave crashing over the polished walls of the chamber, until even the marble pillars seemed to shake. Sweat dripped down the judge's neck. His lips moved, caught between defending the institution and acknowledging the truth unveiling itself, a truth he had no weapon against. His power, once absolute in that room, now trembled under the thunder of voices united as one. It was at this precise moment, when the trial teetered on collapse, that the next surprise walked through the door, someone no one expected to see again. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open once more, their hinges groaning as though warning everyone inside. Heads whipped around instantly, the roars quieting into sudden electric silence. A man entered, his figure sharp against the burning light pouring in from the hall. For a second, no one recognized him. Then gasps shot like sparks through the gallery. It was Inspector Morin, the very officer whose testimony had built the prosecution's foundation months earlier. He was the pillar, the reliable witness, the voice that had confirmed the accusations against Traoré. His word had been treated as stone, irrefutable. Without Morin's statements, much of the case would have never existed at all. But now, here he was, stepping forward slowly, without his uniform, without a badge, carrying nothing but a small envelope in his hands. The crowd leaned back, whispering furiously. Why had he returned? What new game was this? The judge, pale and nervous, cleared his throat. "Officer Morin, you are not expected here. Why do you interrupt?" Morin stopped at the center of the room, his boots firm against the polished floor. He looked from the judge to the prosecutor, and finally into the eyes of Traoré. Something unreadable passed between them, something old, something unresolved. When Morin spoke, his voice cracked like fire against dry wood. "Because I can no longer carry the weight of a lie." Chaos erupted. The gallery shouted. The bailiff surged forward and demanded he explain himself. The prosecutor was on his feet in an instant, face red, spit flying. "This witness is irrelevant. His statements have already been entered into record. He cannot—" Morin raised the envelope high, and the room froze. "This is my own statement," he growled. "Not the one they forced into my mouth, not the one they typed and made me sign. This is the truth I swore to the night I became an officer. And I've kept silent too long." The judge wavered, his breath heavy against the microphone that squealed faintly. "Forced? Are you claiming?" "Yes," Morena thundered. "They told me if I didn't hold the line, if I didn't testify exactly as instructed, I would lose everything. They pressed me until betrayal felt like survival." His eyes dropped in shame. "And I betrayed not just him," he nodded at Traoré, "but the entire promise of justice." The prosecutor slammed his hands on the desk. "Lies, every word, is a desperate fabrication." Morin's dark glare fixed on him like a sword's edge. Then came the betrayal few saw coming. Slowly, carefully, Moran turned his gaze toward the judge himself. "And you," his voice lowered dangerously, "you knew." The gavel slipped from the judge's trembling hand. A cold horror spread across faces in the audience. He knew? He had known all along. Murmurs rose into cries, disbelief into fury. The defense lawyer staggered back as realization spread like fire. This trial was rotten not just from the prosecutor's hand, but from its highest seat of judgment. Reporters didn't know where to aim their pens first. Cameras flashed without pause. And Traoré's stillness shattered at last. His shoulders lifted, his chin tilted forward, and the faintest smile finally cracked that calm mask. Not arrogance, not joy. Something deeper. The look of a man who had trusted time, trusted patience, and finally watched truth unwind. The web spun against him. The gallery broke into shouts. "Shame on you! Expose them all!" Some even stood on benches, fists in the air. The bailiffs could not contain them. The courtroom was no longer a room of law. It was a storm, a living beast of outrage and revelation. And yet, as loud and wild as it grew, the loudest moment had yet to strike, because Morena was not finished. And what he pulled from that envelope next would silence the storm in a way no one was prepared for. For a moment, the envelope felt heavier than stone. Moran stared at it like it burned his hands. The crowd held their breath, bodies leaning forward instinctively, as though what lay inside might decide not just Traoré's fate, but their own faith in justice itself. Slowly, deliberately, Moran pulled out a small stack of papers, worn at the edges, stamped with official seals. He laid them down on the bench in full view of the judge. Gasps ricocheted off the walls. Even from a distance, it was clear. The documents were original. "These," Moran declared, his voice booming, "are copies of the correspondence between the prosecutor's office and my superiors, instructing me to fabricate evidence to testify falsely, to make Adama Traoré a public sacrifice." He slammed a fist against the desk. "This court was never meant to be about justice. It was meant to be theater, and every one of you was supposed to play your part without question." The prosecutor leapt to his feet like a man drowning, clawing at the papers. "This is false, forged. He's manipulating you all." But then came the deadliest blow. From the back, the woman with the tape recorder stood again, pressing play a second time. This time, a new recording emerged. Not just the prosecutor's voice, but the judge's, clear, undeniable. "If this case breaks, we all break. Keep the files buried. Keep the witness in line. Traoré must fall." The courtroom exploded. Chaos thundered in every corner, people screaming, fists slamming against benches. Mothers cried out, journalists screamed into their phones, and chants of "corruption! Corruption!" overtook the air like wildfire. The judge's face was as pale as chalk. His robe suddenly looked like a costume ripped of power. He raised the gavel desperately, banging, shouting, "Order! Order in the court!" But his words felt hollow. Nobody listened anymore. The power had shifted. The authority was gone. And then another twist. A young boy from the gallery, no more than 10 or 11, stood up on the bench and shouted with all the strength in his small lungs, "He's innocent!" It cut through the storm, pure and sharp. Silence followed for the briefest second, and then broke into the loudest eruption of applause the courthouse had ever experienced. People leaped to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even weeping openly. Bailiffs tried to force order but gave up, their own faces betraying the same truth. The case had collapsed. Traoré was no longer a prisoner of accusations. He was a symbol, a living reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, claws its way back to light. Traoré closed his eyes for a brief instant, letting the sound of hundreds of hands strike together wash over him. He had not shouted, not pleaded, not broken. And yet, the courtroom now roared louder in his defense than he ever could have roared for himself. The judge, trembling, dropped his gavel. It clattered helplessly to the floor, a hollow surrender. For the first time in that chamber, the robe did not decide fate. The people did. And in the thunder of applause, laughter, and tears, the walls of that courtroom witnessed something none had expected at sunrise. A man walking out not in chains, but in triumph. The sound of clapping refused to stop. What began, as cautious applause turned into thunder, rattling the old stone pillars until dust trickled down from the high beams above. The chants of "Justice! Justice!" rolled like waves, drowning every attempt at control. And in the center of it all stood Traoré, still as a mountain, unbroken and undeniable. The judge sat slumped in his chair, his robe now nothing more than a heavy fabric draped over a man who had lost everything. His gavel lay abandoned on the floor, soundless now, no longer feared. The prosecutor, once full of venom, found himself shrinking into shadows, his face buried under shame. Their empire of falsehood had collapsed in front of a sea of witnesses. But Traoré never gloated. He didn't shout in triumph or mock those who tried to bury him. Instead, he simply raised his hands to quiet the crowd. When the clamor softened, his voice carried across the chamber, calm, steady, unshakable. You applauded because you knew the truth was alive here today. But applause cannot be the end. If you leave this room clapping only for me, then nothing changes. If you take what you've seen, what you've heard, and you stand for it outside these walls, then change begins. The silence that followed was different now. Not heavy, not fearful, but sharp, alive, electric. Each person in that courtroom carried not just relief, but responsibility. They knew the story of the trial would echo far. Beyond these walls, like fire spilling into the streets, touching every corner. As the guards moved aside and the chains never placed on Traoré's hands were finally set aside, he stepped forward, free. The doors opened wide, and as sunlight poured over his face, the applause followed him out like an unstoppable tide. People reached for his hands, his shoulder, his name rolling off their tongues as though he'd been transformed into more than a man. He was a reminder. Truth bends but does not break, and for every heart that listens, one truth becomes impossible to forget. Justice doesn't happen when we wait for it. Justice happens when we demand it with courage, even at the highest cost. So if this story stirred something in you, don't just leave it behind once the screen fades to black. Carry it forward, share it, speak about it. Let others feel that same surge of fire that filled this courtroom until standing up for truth is no longer rare, it's the standard.